Hello, everybody, and welcome to another Poly 130 lecture. Today, we're going to be looking at a specific case of social revolution, that is the Iranian Revolution of 1979. But before we get into that, let's get into some housekeeping. So the first housekeeping item is don't forget that your reflection paper topics were posted in an announcement on Sakai. So make sure that you only have 2 weeks left, right, to engage in your participation for the course by either submitting a reflection paper, a reading guide, or if your TA has allowed this, a discussion question. So make sure that you do that either this week or next week so that you can get full points on participation for the class. The other thing, I mentioned this last class, but this time it comes with the link. I put a survey on Qualtrics about how you guys are adapting, to figure out how you guys are adapting to virtual instruction. This will be very helpful for me because it is at least likely that we will go into virtual instruction into the summer. But it's also possible that this could last into the fall, so I would need as much feedback as possible as to how to adapt the course to best facilitate learning. And the university is also very interested in figuring out which students are having trouble so that you guys can be accommodated appropriately. So if you go to this link here, you'll probably need to copy and paste it. You can access the survey. It doesn't take very long to fill out, probably fewer than 5 minutes. So just fill that out, and that will be very helpful for everyone in all parts of the university. Finally, I wanted to give you a little bit of information about the final. We are about, let's see, 2 weeks or so out from the final, perhaps a little bit more than 2 weeks out from the final. Our final, of course, is May 5th, starting at, I believe it's 12 o'clock noon. So the final is going to be organized as follows. It'll be 3 out of 5 short essays, and there will be bonus IDs. So remember that because we're doing online instruction, the final will have to be open book, open notes, but not open neighbor. So you are not allowed to share responses with people. We will be using plagiarism checkers and things like this for your responses. That will be facilitated by the fact that they will be, your answers will be submitted electronically. So that is not licensed to violate any honor codes, but of course you will be able to use your notes. So we're going to place more emphasis on things like essays that will be harder for you to just kind of use your notes to get direct answers for, but there will be some IDs in order to help you kind of inflate your grade slightly. So that's kind of the format for the midterm. The test itself will be available for 36 hours. I know that I have students in various time zones, so I want to be able to accommodate where everyone is in the world right now. I also know that our midterm comes during Ramadan, and so I want to make sure that people who are fasting during that period will be able to have a little bit of flexibility to take the exam when they are, well fed, well rested, etc. However, despite the fact that the test is available for you to access for 36 hours, you only have 4 hours to complete the exam. So once you open the exam on Sakai, you will have 4 hours to be able to write these essays and to complete any IDs that are available for bonus. If you have an ARS accommodation, and I have the list from ARS right now, you will obviously be provided the time necessary or the time that is allotted with your accommodation. And luckily enough, Sakai Test and Quizzes has functionality for us to be able to do that. If you have any questions about the final, I have opened up a new tab on the Slack page where you can ask some of those questions because we can't do it in real time. But hopefully this will help. And I'm also doing a final review session next week on Wednesday. So that will be kind of an open session where I'll be on Zoom, and you guys can kind of zoom in and either chat to me or actually, meet with me more or less to ask any questions that you may have about the final. So hopefully that helps. So now let's get back into the topic for today, which is revolution, and we're going to start by doing a little recap. So last class we were talking about kind of what sparks revolutions, and we came up with 4 different theories. The Marxist theory, which basically focused on how class conflict and kind of the revolution, class conflict promoted revolution, and how we should expect revolution to come from those who are most abused by the current class hierarchy. So we should expect the proletariat, peasants, workers, to rise up and try to change the order of society through revolution. We also had grievance theory, which suggested that it's really not necessarily those that are most aggrieved that will be the ones to protest, but rather those whose expectations have been unmet in some way. So it is those people who have an expectation for what they should be achieving and are not achieving that will be the most likely to protest. And so what really matters is your position relative to what you expect, or your position relative to others' position. And those types of grievances are what incites people to revolt. Then we had a theory that was given to us by Theda Skocpol that focused very much on political institutions and political structure, and looked at the way that the state is organized, whether it's an agrarian bureaucracy, whether it faces a military defeat, and whether it has kind of this autonomous peasantry, and how those things together line up to make a country predisposed to revolution. So we have these 3 theories on hand, and we saw kind of how this played out a bit in the Russian Revolution, right? So in Russia, we did have an agrarian bureaucracy. A lot of the landed aristocracy was a part of the political system and the elite. There was a military defeat in the Japanese-Russian War. So a huge military defeats there, defeats in World War I. And so we had an autonomous peasantry organized in the Zemstvos. So all of those things together created precipitous conditions for the revolution that we got in 1917. So today we're going to look at a different class of revolutions, what is called third world revolutions, and try to understand if the features that we looked at last class to explain kind of the classical revolutions in France, China, and Russia also apply to this kind of new category of revolutions in the third world. So the guiding questions that we have for today is 1, what are third world revolutions? How would we define them? How are they distinct from the revolutions we studied last class? What explains the success of the 1979 Iranian Revolution? So that's the case that we're going to be looking at today to apply certain theories to. And then finally, is there or can there be a one-size-fits-all explanation for revolution, or do we need to amalgamate a lot of different theories together in order to explain revolutionary phenomena? So what are third world revolutions? Well, if we look at all of the cases of revolution that we saw last class, right, this handful of cases, we can note that the first 4 or so are actually what we call classical revolutions, right? These are revolutions that happened largely in the earlier part of before 1945, right, pre-World War I, typically in the Western Hemisphere. And so these are our classical cases of revolution. The other cases that we have are what we call third world revolutions. And these are distinct from the classical cases in several ways. So on the one hand, they are geographically concentrated in the global south. So whereas our classical revolutions in Russia, France, Mexico, etc., typically were in the northern and western hemisphere. Here we have revolutions kind of in countries in the southern hemisphere, and also poorer countries, etc. So Nicaragua, Cuba, Zimbabwe, Algeria, Vietnam, China, etc. So that is one feature that distinguishes these, is that they are concentrated in third world countries, concentrated in the global south. Most of these began after World War II, and we can kind of see that in the timeline here. The Chinese Communist Revolution happens in 1945, which kind of sparks off this new pattern of revolution. And then revolutions continue throughout the 1960s, or 50s, 60s, and 70s and 80s. And then the last thing that distinguishes these revolutions is that several of them are much more ideologically based than previous revolutions, and they are also led by these prominent individuals that we come to associate with the revolution. So several of these are communist or leftist revolutions. We can see that with the Chinese Communist Revolution, somewhat in the Vietnamese Revolution. We can see that in the Cuban Revolution, etc. But one thing that kind of unites all of these is we can notice these individuals that we have come to highly associate with the success of the revolutionary movement. So in China, we have Mao Zedong. In Cuba, we have Che Guevara. And in Iran, we have the Ayatollah Khomeini. And all of these people are considered like key figureheads in the movement, and also critical to the success of these movements. So kind of the existence of these individuals allows us to create one new theory of or add one new theory of revolution to the set of theories that we have thus far. So to our theories of Marxism, grievances, and political structure, it is useful to add a voluntaristic theory of revolution as well. So under voluntarism, as we've kind of seen before, it's individuals that are important, right? The actions of individuals are important for understanding outcomes. So here, the actions of individual revolutionary vanguards or revolutionary leaders are the main focus of why revolutions happen. And the success of revolutions are determined by a leader's ability to either use symbols or references, cultural frames, or ideology to basically organize the population and mobilize people into protest. So here, kind of the idea is, without Che Guevara standing here, without Fidel Castro, there would have been no Cuban Revolution, right? We wouldn't have gotten the mass mobilization, or sorry, that's not Fidel, this is Fidel here. We wouldn't have gotten the mass mobilizations that we saw in Cuba throughout the late 1950s, and we would have never had the type of revolutionary change that we had before. And there are tons of pieces on this, right? There are tons of pieces about Che's Foucault strategy and how he really went into the countryside of Cuba, you know, spreading negative, basically criticizing the Batista regime, spreading ideology, kind of getting support for this guerrilla movement that ended up upending the Batista regime in Cuba. So now we have these four theories on board to understand revolution. And in this lecture, what we're going to do is apply them to a case. And that case is going to be the case of Iran. So get ready, because I'm going to engage in a little bit of story time to help you understand how the Iranian Revolution kind of unfolded, how it is distinct from classical revolutions. This is all very important to pay attention to. But for now, for the next couple minutes, it's basically going to be me telling you kind of the history of the Iranian Revolution. So the Iranian Revolution is a very interesting one to study because it very much flies in the face of a lot of theories that we have about classical revolutions. So Iran at the time was ruled by the Pahlavi dynasty. The Pahlavi dynasty had existed in Iran for a very long time, but had come back into force in 1946 under the Mohammad Reza Shah, who was kind of viewed as a modernist, had very friendly relations with the United States, and so was kind of a highly modernized leader of Iran. And that's one of the things that makes Iran such a puzzling case for revolution, because it doesn't fit the standard criteria of what we think, right? It was not an agrarian bureaucracy, although it had been in kind of the pre-1945 era. In by the time we got to the reign of Mohammad Reza Shah in the 1940s and 50s, we no longer had the type of agrarian bureaucracy that Skocpol thought was so critical to revolution, right? In fact, the Mohammad Reza Shah decided to specifically dismantle the agrarian bureaucracy through land reform. So in 1963, he announces this huge sweeping program of economic reforms, which he terms a white revolution. He engages in extreme land reform meant to break up the old landed elite and reduce their power. He modernizes the economy, so he begins to privatize state-owned enterprises, begins to make huge investments into infrastructure so that the oil industry could produce more profits. So there's kind of a huge economic modernization that takes place during this period. And also there is a huge shift towards a more urbanized, more educated population, right? So the percent of people living in cities increases to over 50% during the period of this white revolution. Huge investments are made to educate the population. Large investments made in health, government programs created to elevate the status of the poor, to provide housing, all of this. And all of this is facilitated by, in particular, an oil boom that happens in the 1970s. So even though these programs are started beforehand, they really ramp up in the 1970s when we get the price of oil increasing around 1973. And you can kind of see that here we have the Reza Shah delivering what looks like money, although these may be land deeds to individuals in his country. So due to all of this, we actually get the rapid kind of increase of living standards in Iran over a short period. So from 1950 to 1978, we see GDP per capita increase quite precipitously over the period. And so we don't have a situation where these are extremely poor people. We don't have a situation where there's an agrarian bureaucracy. What we have is a highly modernizing economy leading up in the years leading up to the revolution. However, this economic growth kind of comes at a cost. And the cost is that the Pahlavi dynasty does a lot of things that would spark discontent among the Iranian population. On the one hand, land reform policies and explicit policies pursued by the Pahlavi regime limited the influence of the religious community called the mullahs in Iran. So the mullahs were religious leaders in Iran, largely trained and concentrated in a city called Qum. These leaders had extreme ties with the landed aristocracy. They had very close ties with the landed aristocracy. They were possessed of a lot of land themselves. And so when land reform happened and the aristocracy was weakened, so too were the mullahs, right? A lot of their land was redistributed. to the state, or to redistributed by the state to individuals. A lot of religious schools were closed. The Qom school was maintained, but other schools were closed, and a lot of kind of money was extracted from the religious community, given back to the state in order to fund different programs. So religious leaders in particular felt alienated, and part of this was due to the fact that Pahlavi, or the Mohammad Reza Shah, did not see the need for religion in an increasingly modernized society. He called the religious community turban-headed, kind of backwards turban-headed people, and he thought that religion would ultimately fade away as we modernized Iranian society, much as was the case in Turkey under the Ataturk in the 1900s. So the religious community was sidelined, giving them extreme grievances against the Pahlavi regime. The other thing is that despite the fact that income increased during the period, it didn't increase equitably, right? And so there was actually a lot of income inequality during the period. And particularly, we saw the fall of incomes for certain classes of workers. So it used to be the case that people who were working, the oil industry used to be a not very mechanized industry, right? It involved a lot of workers having to actually spin these, well, I don't really know much about the oil industry, but basically spin the machinery in order to, I guess they're drills, in order to extract oil. But oil by the 1950s and 60s had become more mechanized due to the investments in infrastructure made by the Mohammad Reza Shah. So tons of people got laid off in the oil industry, resulting in falling living standards there. Not to mention that even as incomes were rising over the course of the White Revolution, so too was inflation. So after the oil boom in 1973, there was an oil bust, causing inflation to rise. And so the gap between what people were making and how much of their income inflation was taking up actually decreased over this period. So the real wage increase wasn't actually that high as costs were going up over the period. Beyond that, there were also specific communities of kind of merchants that the Pahlavi regime alienated. So if you've ever been to kind of a Middle Eastern country, you'll know that there in the Medina, there is what we call a bazaar, basically. And it's a bunch of kind of individual shops where people sell different goods. It might be fruit, it might be clothing, jewelry, etc. So the Bazari community in Iran was very well entrenched, very strong, and was specifically, again, marginalized by the Pahlavi regime, who began to stop funding individual loans to Bazaris, increased the price of taxes that they would have to pay. And so we saw the Bazari community also develop grievances against the Pahlavi regime because their standards of living and the cost that they had to pay to kind of invest in the economy was increasing over the period of time. And that led to a lot of kind of discontent among Bazaris, a lot of what we see here, rioting, arson, etc. And in fact, the Bazari community, which had limited ties to the religious community at the beginning of the century, actually developed those ties and began to unite with the religious community in opposition to the Pahlavi regime. Finally, as these protests were ramping up over the period of the late 1960s and 1970s, what we saw was the strengthening of repression against any opposition to the Pahlavi regime. So a secret police force or an intelligence force called SAVAK basically permeated the entire society, launched huge programs to round up suspected militants or suspected agitators, and it kind of intervened in these protests very violently, with arrests, with bullets and shootings, etc. And several people who came out to these kind of limited protests held by either religious leaders, held in bazaars, etc., were often wounded or killed. And interestingly enough, those killings provided yet another opportunity for protest. So one of the phenomena that we saw in the late 1970s in Iran is the phenomena of funeral protests. As people were going to these through these funeral processions, these things would descend into further protest over the kind of overweening repression of the Pahlavi regime. In 1977, Pahlavi sees that, kind of opposition is rising in his country, and for a time pursues a very limited political opening. So as a gesture to the religious community, he allows the Ayatollah Khomeini, who had been a very virulent critic of his regime, back into Iran, in the hopes that the return of some exiled leaders, and kind of the opening of political space would be enough to quiet down revolution and allow his regime to survive. However, that was not the case. Once the Ayatollah Khomeini comes back, this very kind of caustic critic of the regime, his return actually catalyzes even more protest. While he was in exile, he used to write very critical pieces about the Pahlavi regime, pointing out their corruption, pointing out their decadence, how they did not care about the Iranian people, but instead were beholden to foreign interests in the US. And when he comes back, he has a bigger platform for that message, right? And so we begin to see then protests not only catalyze around being anti-Pahlavi, but also being pro-Ayatollah, right? He specifically creates an idea that Islam is the answer to corruption, to foreign influence, etc. And so we should oppose the Pahlavi regime and put a new regime in place that is based around the principles of Islam. And this resonates with a lot of people. Obviously, it resonates with the religious community, but it also begins to resonate with those people who feel that they have been victim to the corruption of the Pahlavi regime. And so what we see then in 1979 is, in fact, the success of the Iranian Revolution. Mohammad Reza Shah exiles himself to Egypt, abdicates his position within Iran as the Shah of Iran. And then we see the imposition following 1979 of an Islamic theocracy in Iran led by the Ayatollah Khomeini. And so that is how we get to the Iranian Revolution. That is the end of story time. And so now what we have left to do in this lecture is try to answer the fundamental question of what explains the success of this revolution. Like how did we get here, and why, out of all the cases where there are people with grievances, did we actually get a full-fledged revolution that changes Iran from a personalistic dictatorship to an Islamic theocracy? So like I said, we have four theories on hand. We have Marxism, grievances, political structure, and voluntarism. And we're going to start off with Marxism to see if that helps to explain the Iranian Revolution. Now, recall that by Marxist theory, what we should expect is that class struggle should be the main source of political conflicts, and that collective action and revolution results from the rejection of a class hierarchy. And that doesn't really seem to ring true in this case, right? Again, even though there were inequalities among classes, the standard of living among most Iranians was increasing over time. So it's not like these people had large absolute grievances, that they were completely impoverished and wanted to change their position in the class hierarchy. Moreover, peasants themselves, right, those who are at the lowest rungs of society, weren't actually terribly anti-Pahlavi. Again, in the White Revolution, the Shah made a particularly strong effort to reduce poverty in Iran by promoting land reform, by allocating more money to housing, allocating more money to actually poverty reduction programs, health and education. And so we saw that the peasants, more so than any other perhaps social class in Iran, were actually constituents and allies of the Pahlavi regime rather than people that would naturally rebel against it. So it is unlikely then that Marxism is really a good explanation for the revolution that we saw in Iran. Also note that it was not a communist revolution, it was more of an Islamic revolution. So Marxism is kind of, that's another reason to kind of eliminate Marxism as an explanation. Now, grievances is another explanation that we could use to understand this revolution. And remember here that the point is that relative deprivation is the reason for revolution, right? So we see our living standards increase for a time. We expect that they will continue to do so. And then once that increase stops happening, we begin to become aggrieved because we thought we should be doing a lot better. And that is kind of the point at which you see revolution. So here is the right point for revolution. Once our expectation for what we should have in society and what we actually have has a big gap between it. And there is some evidence of this, right? Remember that we saw incomes increase over the period of time, but around 1976, incomes begin to decrease, right? And at the same time, the cost of living is increasing. So we are seeing a decrease in real wages, right? What people can actually afford with their wage. So if I'm an Iranian and I'm kind of seeing this growth and I'm expecting it to continue into the future, and then I experience this downturn, then maybe I do become more aggrieved and more willing to protest. This is perhaps exacerbated by the fact that the Pahlavi regime itself did not seem to be suffering following the oil boom, right? They seem to be still enjoying a very decadent life, largely due to corruption. So in one particular incident, there was a party held for the 2500th anniversary of the I don't know if it was of the Pahlavi regime, but it was a 2500th anniversary kind of the existence of Iran. A very decadent party was held for foreign dignitaries, etc. There was alcohol, champagne, all of this other stuff. And no native Iranians were actually allowed to come to this party. And so that was one of the things that led to kind of this perception that there was extreme income inequality. Beyond that, there were reports that the Pahlavi regime itself extracted most of the money from oil wealth through foundations, etc., billions of dollars being funneled to Mohammad Reza Shah himself and to relatives that were involved in this Pahlavi foundation. So those types of inequalities, right? The difference between what people expected to get, what they were actually getting, and then the difference between what the highest rungs of society were getting and what kind of the middle rungs were getting might have promoted enough grievances to make revolution possible. So there is at least some weight for the grievances explanation. Then we have this political structure explanation that we can look at. And remember that in political structure, Theda Skocpol's kind of description of how political structure matters for revolution. Political structure tends to predispose societies towards revolution. And again, what you need to have is an agrarian bureaucracy, a military defeat, and a popular insurrection, and then you'll get a revolution. Well, in the Iranian case, we can kind of see that that is not, that explanation doesn't seem to fit, right? There wasn't an agrarian bureaucracy. Land reform had eliminated the landed aristocracy in many ways. There had been no military defeat. The Iranian regime was largely propped up by the US, and so they didn't face any particular military threats during that period. And there was no peasant insurrection. As I mentioned before, the peasant class was largely on the side of the Pahlavi regime. So that doesn't seem to square. But Skocpol and Goodwin, Skocpol teamed up with a guy named Jeff Goodwin to develop kind of a revised theory for how political structure might matter in a third world revolution. So here again, political structure increases the likelihood of revolution. So again, it's less deterministic than her previous theory, where she said revolutions aren't made, they come. Here, revolutions become only more likely. They're not definitely going to happen, but they become more likely as certain elements of the state come into play. And here, what matters for her is how deeply the regime is penetrated into the far reaches of society. So basically, how many brown areas are there, how exclusive the regime is, and how bureaucratized the regime is. So when there is low penetration, right? The state has a lot of brown areas. There are a lot of places where the state influence doesn't reach. When the state is highly exclusionary, and when bureaucratization is low, i.e. when the state is personalistic, when we have a personalistic regime in place, then the likelihood of revolution increases across these three dimensions. So we're going to see that likelihood go up and up and up. And that is something that we had in Iran. So key constituencies were alienated. So there were areas which state influence wasn't as high as it should have been. So even though the government was doing all of these reforms to help poor people, they were not really helping the working class. Again, Bazaris were basically denied government loans to help them sponsor businesses, and there was alienation of this kind of merchant class. So the state did not fund this class as well as it did, for example, the peasant class. There were also limited political freedoms and severe repression. So we saw the regime become much more exclusionary over time. So I mentioned that Savak engaged in kind of these mass arrests, tortures, and killings of political dissidents. So that is kind of leading us to the highly exclusionary part of the regime. And also it was a very personalistic regime. Most of political power revolved around the Shah and his relatives. So we kind of had that perfect formula for revolution according to Skocpol. And remember that when the issue with personalistic regimes is that when the person that the regime revolves around falls, we tend to get these revolutionary situations. So we do seem to have a bit of weight on the political structure explanation as well, at least the revised one that came out for third world revolutions by Skocpol and Goodwin. And finally, we can look at voluntaristic explanations to see if those hold. And in fact, there is a lot of evidence that they do. You really cannot deny that the Ayatollah Khomeini became a focal point of the revolution in Iran, right? And that is attested to by the fact that his return galvanized a lot more support for the Iranian revolution, gave kind of a framework for what revolution would look like and what the state would look like afterwards. And of course, he became the leader of the Iranian state following revolution. The Ayatollah himself did a couple of things that I think were critical to promoting revolution in Iran. On the one hand, he was one of the early leaders of resistance among Iranian clerics against the Pahlavi regime. So in the 1960s, when the Pahlavi regime began to sideline the religious community in Iran, he was one of its most outspoken critics and began to lead kind of protests that happened, which is eventually what led to his exile. In exile, he publicized reports of the corruption of the Pahlavi regime, and so would write kind of these manifestos about very much critiquing the Pahlavi regime for being, again, beholden to US interests rather than the needs of Iranians, for engaging in corrupt practices, etc. And then by the time he came back into the country, he really focused support around the need for Islam as the answer to the corruption of the Pahlavi regime, and used specific symbols from Iran's Islamic history to create support for this revolutionary movement. And some of those are talked about in the Scotch Poll reading. So I'll leave you to read that to kind of understand what specific symbols and ideology he used. And so we can say that there is also some credence to the voluntaristic response as well. So what I would ask you to do is take some time for yourself to try and figure out which explanation you believe is best and most robust for accounting for the success of the Iranian Revolution. So pause this video, think about it. But now I'm going to ask, well, okay, maybe you've settled on one explanation, but do you think that this can apply to all revolutions, right? Is there a one-size-fits-all explanation of revolution? And I am not going to answer this definitively. I'm just going to kind of give you my perspective on this as a summation of our Revolutionary Week. And to sum up, I honestly think that a revolution, as I mentioned before, is an extremely rare and also very singular or unique phenomenon, right? I think to try and create a one-size-fits-all explanation for revolution is probably an exercise in futility, simply because it is almost impossible to believe that something that would explain the French Revolution, which happened in 1789, would also explain the Iranian Revolution, which happened nearly 2 centuries later, when the actors involved, the grievances, the regime, even just kind of the way that society looked at these 2 time periods was so very different, right? So it's hard for me to believe that the same things that could explain this revolution would also be able to explain this one. I do think that, honestly, as we saw with the Iranian case, that grievances, structure, and leaders tend to be important for promoting revolution, right? It is very clear that if people aren't aggrieved, if they don't have anything to revolt about, there will be no revolution. But again, people always have grievances. And there are not always revolutions, so something else must come into play. Sometimes the political structure is just enough to get you to a revolution, but sometimes you need other things. And one of the things that I think is very helpful to do is, let's assume that we definitely need grievances to promote revolution, that states create conditions that are useful for revolution, but within those conditions, right, if you have a state that is, either agrarian bureaucracy with military defeat, or a state that has low penetration, high exclusion, and low bureaucratization, you still need individual leaders to work within this structure to create revolution. It is within these structures, if an individual leader does not come into play to help kind of focus the revolution, to help mobilize people, to give it a relevant frame or a sense of purpose, then we don't get revolution. So I think it's useful to actually think of these things as working together. Finally, I think it's useful to think about these explanations in terms of necessary and sufficient conditions. And if you've never heard this terminology before, a necessary condition is something that has to be true for an outcome to occur. So, for example, the idea that you need gas for starting a car, so gas would then be a necessary condition for starting a car. Whereas a sufficient condition is a condition that is true if an outcome occurs, but is not needed for that outcome to occur. So rain pouring from the sky is a sufficient condition for the ground to be wet, but you don't need it to actually rain for the ground to be wet. You could put the hose on the ground, you could, a sprinkler could go off, a water main could break. And so while we might consider grievances, for example, to be a necessary condition of revolution, you must have a grievance in order for a revolution to occur. Maybe things like individual leaders or state structure are only sufficient conditions, right? When revolution happens, we have certain state structures in place, but those things don't have to be in place for the revolution to occur, right? So I think I'll leave you with the final kind of food for thought, What do you believe are the necessary and sufficient conditions for revolution based on the things that you have read and the cases that we have explored? And then this is what you can think about kind of over the weekend. And then for next class, we're going to be talking about democratic deconsolidation and the rise of right wing populism. And I just suggest that you do the readings. You can do the readings for what it would be Wednesday of next week. If you want to understand that lecture as it comes out on Monday, or you could just wait until Wednesday when you've done the readings and then watch the lecture. Then it's no difference to me. I want this to be flexible for you. So again, it was nice talking to you. One of the last times we're going to come together, but I'll see you next week for our very final lecture, and then the final session on Wednesday. Hope you're having a great time, and not going too stir crazy in your homes. See you later.